Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event on global ayahuasca, a book talk with the anthropologist Alex Gearin. My name is Jeffrey Breau, and I am a program lead for the Psychedelics and Spirituality Initiative at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Today's event is part of the center's Psychedelics and the Future of Religion series, which is now in its sixth year. This work is part of the center's ongoing and evolving initiative called Transcendence and Transformation, or TNT for short. If you're interested in our psychedelics and spirituality program, the TNT initiative, or any of the other research happening at the center, I will put links to our homepage and our newsletter sign up in the chat. Should be in there now. I also put a link in the chat for the homepage of the Harvard Study of Psychedelics in Society and Culture. The CSWR is one of three centers at Harvard that are focused on the many ways that psychedelics appear in society, and the newsletter linked to on the homepage there will keep you abreast of all that's happening in the world of psychedelics and society and culture here at Harvard. For those of you joining today's conversation, you may also be interested in our upcoming Psychedelic Intersections Conference. This is our fourth annual Psychedelics Conference held at Harvard Divinity School on April 10th and 11th this year. We're currently at a wait list for in-person attendance, but the conference will be live streamed and there's lots of space available for sign up on the live stream still. And you can also sign up for the wait list. We're hoping we'll be able to accommodate as many people as possible. This year's conference is going to include keynote presentations by Benjamin Breen, Tiona Zazul, and Ramzi Fawaz, along with over 40 scholars presenting across 7 panels and 2 conversation sessions. And I'll also put now a link to the Psychedelic Intersections page, and the schedule and registration links are on that. All right, with that housekeeping out of the way, in today's event, I am joined by Alex Gearin, who's going to be speaking about his 2024 book, Global Ayahuasca, Wondrous Visions and Modern Worlds, which was published by Stanford University Press. Alex K. Gearin is a medical anthropologist specializing in the intersections of mental health, social context, and cultural beliefs. His research focuses broadly on the bodily, narrative, and spiritual dimensions of psychedelic medicine usage in neo-shamanic and clinical contexts, exploring socio-cultural dimensions of experience, all topics that we will be discussing here today. He is published on psychedelic medicine in Current Anthropology, Social Science and Medicine, Neuroethics, the JRAI Journal, and other outlets. And Alex serves as assistant professor and deputy director of the Medical Ethics and Humanities Unit at the School of Clinical Medicine at the University of Hong Kong. So to give a quick sense of how the rest of the evening will unfold, in a minute, I will pass things over to Alex, who will provide about a 15-minute overview of his research and work in global ayahuasca. And following that, Alex and I will be in conversation about the book, its arguments, and its implications for the wider psychedelic research world. Throughout our conversation, I will be pulling in questions from the audience, so please submit your questions at any point through the Zoom tab. Though we may not have time to answer or ask every audience question that is presented, I will share all of the comments and questions with Alex so that he can see the depth of inquiry that his remarks have generated. With all of that out of the way, I will pass things over to Alex to introduce his work and book. Thank you so much for being here, Alex.
The pleasure's mine. Thanks, Jeff. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been admiring all of the stimulating psychedelic research and events coming out of Harvard. It's a special time for psychedelic humanities, and really Harvard's been creating space for a lot of conversations to be had. So it's an honor to be here to share some of my book. So the book Global Ayahuasca is it's an anthropological text. It's a ethnography based on fieldwork that I've done in 3 sites across 10 years. And at the core of the book is a question that has kind of shaped a lot of anthropological thinking about ayahuasca and psychedelic use. And that is, to what extent does the context, the setting, the history, the sociocultural environment shape the raw kind of phenomenological or experiential aspects of these drugs? How does context shape experience, and what matters when we want to um, think about that? So um, in many ways, the book, is a continuation of a lot of work in anthropology, but at the same time, it's kind of positioned in a way to come up against a whole lot of um, homogenizing discourse we have around what is the psychedelic experience, which is partly a kind of cultural phenomena today, but also it's been driven by kind of evidence-based science that has been doing a lot of great work to try and understand, what's therapeutic about a psychedelic experience or what's mystical about a psychedelic experience. And really, I see the book as kind of contributing to that conversation and trying to create more space for cultural difference in this conversation. Um, as an anthropologist, I've been long interested in questions of the body and the senses, embodiment, how people's sensory experiences are different cross-culturally. And ayahuasca is a fantastic um, example to explore this because, I'm probably speaking to people with a lot of psychedelic literacy here. It's 2026. Psychedelics are booming in the US and elsewhere. So a lot of people have an awareness, a knowledge base on these substances. But, for anyone, any kind of fringe person out there today, just to help us get started, then, we could begin by thinking about the phenomenology or the experiential aspects of ayahuasca is involving a range of time-limited effects on the body, on perception, such as an enhancement of feeling or mood. People classically say psychedelics can make people cry or laugh, or maybe they'll see different patterns or colors as the kind of iconic cliche notion. But you also have distortions and changes in time perception, and a range of others. Um, so if you look back at ayahuasca research, ayahuasca is the Amazonian indigenous brew, comes from the Peruvian, Colombian, Brazilian Amazon. Historically, um, you see that the early anthropologists were also fascinated with this question about, well, what are the common denominators of an ayahuasca experience? For example, Michael Hana, the great anthropologist, in 1973, did this synthesis of anthropological research to try and get a sense of what are these common elements of ayahuasca experiences in indigenous settings. And these ranged in his analysis from visions of big cats, jaguars, snakes, um, to translocating vision to neighboring settlements or up rivers, to other planets. And also there was a category of kind of social perception of sorcery and antagonism. And he finished that seminal paper calling for more comparative work on the Yahe or the ayahuasca experience. So I was kind of intrigued by this notion that it would be possible to study cross-culturally and get a sense of, well, what are the common elements of an ayahuasca experience? Um, and you see this quest, if you will, playing out in other fields as well. So, in more recent studies, the great cognitive psychologist Benny Shannon did a study on ayahuasca where he surveyed 154 ayahuasca drinkers, indigenous, non-indigenous, and attempted to kind of create a cartography of what are the most frequently seen things within an ayahuasca experience. And he created this interesting table where at the very top you had things like supernatural beings, were the most common, angels or animal beings. And at the very bottom, the most least were seen in his analysis were biographical visions, people having visions of their upbringing or their past, insects, and household items and stuff like this. And this intrigued me because as an anthropologist, I kind of cut my teeth doing field work in Australia among neo-shamanic groups that had kind of appropriated ayahuasca shamanism and turned it into something which kind of suited their needs and their cosmology more. And here I was seeing regularly a whole lot of biographical narratives coming out of people's descriptions of their ayahuasca experiences that the biographical side of life was really showing up quite richly in these experiences here. However, it was, at the very bottom of Benny Shannon's cartography of what are frequent ayahuasca visions. Um, and so, Shannon's work was a great inspiration to me that if anyone's interested in the phenomenology of ayahuasca, they should really go and read his book, The Antipodes of the Mind. Um, but my book really takes off where I think he kind of missed a few things, and that is to say that context really can provide a way of understanding variations in the types of experiences people have. Um, Another example would be, for example, some scientists have described the explanation for what shapes a psychedelic experience, that culture is a kind of prosaic explanation, but we really want to find out what is the cognitive biological basis for similarities across ayahuasca experiences. And so, and that's all to say that, I kind of see my role in a way as challenging that. And that challenging role came out of my ethnographic experience. So we could call it a kind of ethnographic theory, where I was seeing one thing in the field and another thing in the literature, and I decided, well, look, I think anthropology can help us understand this in a different way. Um, so my field work, as I said, was across three sites. It started in Australia. I did a large project for my PhD on neo-shamanic ayahuasca use across Australia. And just quickly, I'll mention the other two sites were, so that was in 2011 to 14, my field work in Australia. And then in 2019, just before the COVID-19 pandemic, which was kind of the peak of ayahuasca tourism, global tourism going to Peru, I went and spent 3 months, several months with a Shipibo family of ayahuasca healers who were servicing people coming from abroad to seek healing and shamanic experiences. And so that's the second site that I look at in the book, this intercultural space of shamanic tourism in Peru. And the third site, which was in 2019, but also a little bit during COVID, is in metropolitan China. At the time, I was living in Fujian in southern China, so I had access to go and visit some of these really kind of, I guess you would call them pioneering groups. And the Chinese context was interesting for several reasons, which we'll get into. But in a way, it's a kind of what I argue is a nominally secular or hyper-modern form of ayahuasca use, and it offers a foil to really think and triangulate these other contexts. Um, so just briefly to kind of describe the argument that the book attempts to build, and then we can go into each ethnographic site and talk about the more kind of qualitative or juicy elements of ethnographic work. In the Australian context, a lot of people were motivated to drink ayahuasca up in the mountains outside of the city in a quest to overcome a sense of disenchantment that the modern world had essentially sucked the spirit out of life, and that they were searching for meaning, for purpose, to try and kind of soothe their suffering, to soothe their mental illness, and to understand their place in the universe. That ayahuasca here was engaging the meaning crisis of modern society, as it's sometimes called. So I saw, in ceremonies, people drinking ayahuasca and communing with a nature, kind of a mother nature-like goddess called Mother Ayahuasca, who is an embodiment of nature, of the plants and the animals and the rivers, and that this natural organic purity could essentially purify the body of people coming from what was sometimes described as a toxic society. That society was bereft of spirit, was bereft of a kind of natural condition of life, and that ayahuasca was reconnecting them to their true nature. Um, so we saw here, ayahuasca kind of re-enchanting a modern, disenchanted urban Australian. And then the Peruvian site is actually kind of similar, and of course, there are variations in the Australian site, and we can get into that. And there are variations in the Peruvian tourism site, and we can get into that. But I'm just going to draw some kind of general differences here to build up the picture. In the intercultural space of Shipibo tourism, where foreigners are coming to drink ayahuasca with indigenous people, we see a few things happening in this context. One is that it builds upon what in anthropology there's a, an interesting body of research on primitivist tourism. So that is when people from urban, typically affluent societies are seeking contact with a more simple, primordial way of life that they perceive in indigenous communities, such as in Papua New Guinea or in parts of Africa, and they go to seek this kind of primordial contact with the origins of humanity, if you will. And so that really kind of shapes the types of experience that people were having, that they could have. Of course, it does not define every experience that someone has on retreat in Peru, but you see these trends emerging where foreigners are coming and imbibing ayahuasca with indigenous Shipibo who are performing a new kind of intercultural ceremony that's not quite Shipibo and it's not quite what you see in Australia, but it's this hybrid, if you will. Um, so I looked at both the experience of the Shipibo healers and the foreigners. And one way of thinking about that is exploring the types of the wonder and awe, which are key kind of qualities that people often describe drinking ayahuasca. Just this profundity of astonishment of wow, how could that possibly happen? How could I sense the world like this, or get a sense of translocating across time and space and yada yada, on and on. That in fact we see very different types of wonder coming out of the Shipibo healers, ayahuasca drinking, and the clients that they're coming along. And finally, in the Chinese context, we see what I've described as a kind of hyper-modern form of ayahuasca use, which is nominally secular. So here, ayahuasca is being was being used. This group has since finished um, for essentially attempting to both kind of heal people who are dealing with stress in their lives and wanting to become kind of better people, better fathers and sisters and mothers and whatnot, but also to execute a greater mastery over their work. So as a kind of professional development, if you will, where ayahuasca is being used in these coaching style arrangements where people would drink them in groups and explore how to become a better manager in their job, or how to come up with a new business idea, or refine something that's happening in their business. So we see this application of ayahuasca experiences to very kind of instrumental aspects of corporate life. Um, Now, so if you just contrast that for a moment to the what I described happening in Australia, you see a very sharp difference at play. And I argue that one way of understanding these three very different contexts is to consider how each person in this context relates to modernity as a kind of imaginary. How do we imagine the modern world? What does it mean to exist in a modern world? Is the modern world essentially bereft of spirit? Is it kind of toxic? Is it a place that I don't feel at home, which you find a fair bit in the kind of new age, neo-shamanic context in Australia? Is modernity something that is quite alluring, as you see among Shipibo healers that are seeking from drinking ayahuasca and giving it to foreigners, a way of accessing more capital for safety, capital for building resources for their family, where you see the wonder of ayahuasca being shaped by these modernization attitudes. And there's actually a whole back literature on that, which we can go into if you want, on how indigenous visions have often included visions of the city and futuristic civilizations and a kind of modernity. And finally, the Chinese context, as I described, was a kind of hyper modern, where the brew and its visionary wonders are being kind of channeled towards executing a greater mastery over modern life, where modernity is not renounced or critiqued, but it's very much embraced, even if it's stressful, and that's part of what ayahuasca is doing, is helping with those those stresses. So I think that's probably a good general introduction. I thought one thing to finish on with that is that you know, um, people might say, well, culture shapes the visions, that depending on the culture you come from, that's going to shape the type of visions you have. Um, I'm inspired by Esther Langdon, the anthropologist, who took it one step further in her analysis of Siona indigenous ayahuasca use in the 80s, in the 70s, where she said actually culture provides the ability to navigate the visions well. So the type of visions you might have in she would her theorization would suggest how you move through those visions is somewhat dictated by how you move through your own culture, how you know your own culture. What is your own kind of culture? And that's a complicated question today. Anthropologists tried to get rid of the concept of culture in the 90s. They kind of failed, but it was good. It was a good attempt. Um, and we live in a very kind of fluid, multiple space in today's globalized world. But context, I think, is more important than ever for us to really try and get a sense of of how diverse ayahuasca experiences can be, and what matters for an ayahuasca experience. So yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Alex. That's I think there's a lot here we can discuss. And I actually was hoping to start our conversation with more of a methodological curiosity and wondering for you, you mentioned you have the three sites that are represented in Global Ayahuasca. There's the Peruvian site, which is a tourist retreat center, really focused on non Peruvian participants. And then you have the Australian site and the Chinese site. I'm curious, as you were preparing to do this work, what was it that was drawing you to these three sites? What was your process of finding the sites? And why did you feel like these three in particular would be useful in conversation with one another?
Yeah, thank you. It's been a long journey, and I think it's mainly serendipity would be most of the answer to that question. I began my PhD in 2011 in Australia, and at the time, but just prior to that research project, in fact, I was planning to go to Peru. I was already quite literate in the Amazonian literature on ayahuasca at the time, and I thought, gosh, I got to go to Peru and study the real thing. And it was actually an anthropology professor who gave me some really good advice and asked whether there had been any detailed ethnographic work done on ayahuasca use outside of South America. And in fact, at that stage in 2011, there hadn't been. there'd been a couple of papers here and there, but not a dedicated, like multiple year ethnographic project. So he really encouraged me to study the scene in Australia, and which I did. And that was really interesting because, the ayahuasca in Australia was really just forming at that point, or probably around 2004 to 2010, it started to form. And it essentially came out of a small niche psychonautic culture of people who were not necessarily interested in healing, but we're more interested in exploring the mind, exploring consciousness, religious diversity, taking lots of different types of psychedelics. Um, and it was from this subculture that we saw the crystallization of an ayahuasca culture, which became far more interested in healing, in connecting with Mother Nature, um, and with kind of, I'd say, some more new age concepts than you see in the psychonautic culture, which is much more um, anarchistic, experimental, um, I would say adventurous, where people are not necessarily dealing with the type of mental illnesses that attract people to ayahuasca ceremonies in Australia today. So I got the chance to kind of study something as it was forming, and that was really exciting. So I did that, and then I always wanted to, and actually, so when I got to the field during my, like when I started my field work for my PhD, I hadn't known anyone in the ayahuasca scene. I knew some of the psychonautic networks, but when I hit the scene there, I was surprised to learn that this is a healing culture.
Hmm.
People here are suffering, and they're coming here to heal. So I had to go back and change my methods from kind of questions of morality and religion to medical anthropology. And that was quite interesting. So I was like, oh, this is a healing movement, right? And it's not only that, but for the most part, I think that's kind of what and more now as it's medicalizing, I think it's becoming even more of a therapeutic space. So
As you
then
were
in
watching, sorry to
yeah.
just a quick question on that. As you were watching this scene form, and also it sounds like evolve from its psychonautic roots into its ayahuasca roots. It sounds like that there was a shift you were observing away
Yeah.
from into a healing modality. And I'm curious, so what you were seeing its earlier forms looking like the psychonautic users of ayahuasca or just of other substances, like what were they focused on in your observations?
Well, that psychonautic culture, um, you can explore it through the work of like Des Tramarki or Graham St. John or the Entheogenesis Australis group, is really an experimental space of consciousness exploration. Yeah, sure, there are people like overcoming health issues in that area, but it is, I would say, a kind of qualitatively different type of social space. The types of psychedelic use there are much more unstructured, non-ritualized, spontaneous, popping up at like outdoor music festivals or just small groups of people doing it in their houses or their basements as the metaphor is commonly used. Um, and this network is also was like experimenting with lots of different recreational chemicals, as they're sometimes called. Um, dipropyltryptamine, methoxetamine, all sorts of different stuff. And you saw some actual interesting innovations coming out of this space. So Changa, which is a global phenomenon now, was created by a group of Australians who realized that you could mix that in the Amazonian traditions, they were mixing the beta carbolines from ayahuasca with the tryptamines from the plants and blowing it up people's noses. And so someone thought, well, why can't we just smoke it? So they developed these smokable forms of ayahuasca. Mind you, a lot of the changa out there today doesn't have beta carbolines in it, so it's not technically changa, but that's just one for the connoisseurs to quibble over, I guess. Um, yeah, so but then you saw suddenly the ayahuasca groups emerged and it became a commercial enterprise. So
Mhm.
people would pay money, you know, in the beginning, probably like $200, $300 for a retreat, sometimes much less actually. Um, and people started wearing all white. um, and people and a certain type of music emerged, ceremony songs, and now there are these like when I say now, actually, I have to watch myself because my field work was 10 years ago now there, and I'm sure it's changed in important ways. But there are these ceremonial songbooks that are used across groups, and the most prolific kind of neo shaman or facilitator, as they're called, by 2012 had done 1,500 ayahuasca ceremonies globally. Darpan, as he's mentioned in the book, became one of the most prolific ayahuasca facilitators globally. And so yeah, and so it really is its own. It became its own culture.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I'll let you go back to the original question and talk about the other
Oh
sites
yeah.
and how you found them. But maybe we can circle back later in the conversation because it sounds like what you're observing here or were observing is really the emergence of, yes, a different psychedelic culture, but one that has also now, in my sense, evolved into the church, psychedelic church world, where you're maybe a little
Mm.
bit more buttoned up, like reverence looks different than it looks like in a festival setting. Ritual looks different, and that is, yeah. Well, let's circle back to that because it's a fascinating thread to sort of be at least at one ground level of in Australia.
Exactly. And like, so in a second, I'll talk about the Peruvian side, which is tourism, people coming for 10 days or 2 weeks usually for a package. In Australia, it's more like a church in the sense that, and when I say it's more like a church, it's in the sense of it being spiritual but not religious. Because I know that my ayahuasca friends in these groups would feel uncomfortable with me even making that association to a church. There is this radical spiritual sovereignty that's really valued within these ayahuasca neo-shamanic spaces, that it's not hierarchical, it's horizontal and it's individual and um, but it's you could say it's church-like in the sense that people like I also did a survey of I think it was about 100 ayahuasca drinkers in Australia, mainly from one network, one email list. And on average, people would drink ayahuasca once every 2 months.
Mhm.
Some people would come once a month. Some people would come once and never again. There was a high turnover. People, this was a new thing. People are interested, they try it and whatnot. But on average, it's about once every 2 months. And definitely there were regulars coming once a month, which is a kind of church style um, practice, you could
Structure.
say. Yeah. And people get to know each other and it becomes a sense of community and that can kind of shape the types of meaning and even the types of experiences people have, I would say. In Peru, what attracted me there, well, I was working and living in southern China in an anthropology department at the time, and I got a grant to go and study in Peru. And I was attracted to Pachamama Temple, which is a Shipibo-led a kind of ayahuasca retreat that's not happening anymore. Um, for several reasons. One was it was a family of Shipibo healers, so I thought that's quite unique. And also, it had an interesting economic arrangement where the Shipibo healers had a lot more say in the business operations of Pachamama, which you don't see elsewhere. In 2019. Carlos Avros Suarez, the Spanish anthropologist, he estimated that there were about 70 ayahuasca retreats in Iquitos, Peru, that are serving foreigners, like international retreats, charging on average about 1,500 USD a retreat. The high majority of those, almost all of them, were owned by foreigners who are contracting indigenous healers.
Mm.
Um, So a whole lot of, well, not a whole lot, but some anthropologists, colleagues of mine and myself included, Daniela Peluso, Bernard Brabeck de Mori, and others have noted that this economic asymmetry can resemble a kind of colonial imperialistic arrangement where the capital comes from outside and can kind of determine certain types of relations and certain types of ways in which uh, of value moves through the system. And that's, partly just because in order to, attract internationals, it's very hard for Shipibo or other indigenous masters to be able to build a website, market on Facebook or however they market, bring in influencers and build up a business. So there's, that's kind of part of the
I would imagine
challenge.
also sort of to the your point about primitivist tourism and the desires from paying clients, mostly from Europe and America, that it also
Mm.
would probably be there are barriers for Shipibo maestros to be too engaged in technology from a business standpoint. Was that something you were seeing? I could imagine that being a sort of a colonial influence there.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just like exposure to the expectations of foreigners, the knowledge of foreigners, the cosmology of foreigners. The Shipibo healers I worked with, they don't know who Timothy Leary or Terence McKenna or any of these people are, right? Um, but they do come from a very rich indigenous heritage and ancestral practice of training their bodies to engage with master plants. Um, so I was really interested in how they were kind of transforming their ancestral practice in a way that would be useful to helping foreigners coming in. Um, and there's some interesting research looking at these kind of productive misunderstandings as Lazonsky and Cappo, the anthropologists, talk about it, and others, where people where Shipibo healers can have quite a different view of what it means to have a vision of say a scary vision, where it can usually be seen as having some sort of social origin, that it's related to the intentions of another person, or even unwittingly coming from another person who's just got a big energy and they're really kind of angry or envious, or they have some sort of negative energy, and then that's turning up in your psyche and your body and it needs to be healed. So that, I mean, sorcery was something I was really kind of fascinated about. There's a rich literature on the role of sorcery in the Amazon, for example, as indigenous people in Peru urbanize. You see, like Glenn Shepherd's work and others see a rise in sorcery, where issues of jealousy and envy and inequality tend to aggravate these kind of experiences among urban indigenous people in Peru. So I was kind of curious about that because it's a very different model of the mind and a model of healing than what you see in Australia. And and so I I was also working with Paris Toom, who's a filmmaker, to help capture um, Rosa Pinedo Vasquez, who's the lead healer at Pachamama, to capture their oral histories, their views of ayahuasca globalization, which we published on carpi.net, along with, I would say about a quarter or half of my interviews are published on there in their kind of raw form to help get their voice out in their terms. Um, so that was a kind of rewarding and really insightful site, ethnographic site for the book.
Yeah.
And then the Chinese context came up during a conference. So I was at a conference in Europe, and I met this guy from Europe who had been running ayahuasca groups in a tier one city, one of the major cities in China, for 6 years. And so I was quite fascinated that this was even happening. At the beginning, I thought, oh gosh, I probably shouldn't research this. It's quite dangerous given the draconian drug laws and issues there. But in fact, I was just so intrigued by the fact that this was happening. I decided to go and have a peek at what was happening.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned in your response about sorcery and the way that it's showing up in the Shipibo context. I found this one of the more surprising moments in global ayahuasca is when you're talking about how much effort the facilitators, the maestros, the ayahuasqueros at the retreat center are putting into preventing attacks from other ayahuasqueros. And yet all of that effort was hidden from the participants, or was largely hidden. I'm actually curious if you had a sense of the tourists who were there, the people who were participating, if they knew, had any sense of these attacks, and also why, in your understanding, it was important to have that be hidden from the majority of participants.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so actually it wasn't hidden from the participants. Participants were hearing the healers. We would have these knowledge seminars, and the healers would speak very openly about it. But I do mention in the book how in I've heard that in other retreats in Peru,
I
there
see.
are efforts to kind of demarcate the space between the contracted Shipibo healers and the guests, that that the guests don't actually interact with the healers much, except during the ceremonies where it's kind of dark and the healers come in like rock stars at at night once everyone's sitting there and ready. And so I wondered, why is there not more social mingling happening in these retreats? And I hypothesized that part of the reason is that um, we're talking about at least two very different metaphysical systems here. The indigenous Amazonian shamanism understandings, which are diverse and eclectic, you could say, in their own right, um, can be quite confronting and jarring to a foreigner who's coming down to kind of heal their trauma. But in fact, at Pachamama, we would have these knowledge seminars, and the healers would talk about a kind of a common discourse among shamans in the Amazon is your origin story. How did you become a healer? Who did you get your power, your training from? And there's a whole kind of lineage discourse around building up these identities. And so we would sit around and listen to these stories, and we were also told that, during each, and these stories in sometimes, actually more often than not, involved, oh, I became a shaman or a curandero because I was struck by a grave sickness out of nowhere, and I thought I was going to die, or and then I had to learn how to heal myself, and so I went and dieted in these plants and learned these traditions, and kind of built my strength back up. So you see this kind of like wounded healer narratives, which often enough had a kind of sorcery element. Not always, but that was a part of it. And then during the ceremonies themselves, the atmosphere of the ceremony in the Shipibo space is really remarkable. So you're in this maloka, like a massive big wooden hut, and in the middle of the space, you have like 5 or 6 Shipibo healers laying down on mattresses, and then around the perimeter, all of the foreigners laying down. And everyone drinks ayahuasca, and the Shipibo healers come up to this. So there's a bunch of healers, and they come up and give you a one-on-one song. So you're asked to sit up and face the healer, and they'll sing these powerful icaros to cleanse your body, to help bring good visions, and to do healing work. And then they'll give you an icaro, and then they'll move on to the next person. So the atmosphere is remarkable. You have this polysonic environment where there's multiple icaros happening at the same time. And there's always one person, one Shipibo healer, who's in the middle of the maloka, not transmitting a song for healing, but who's doing a protective song to kind of protect the maloka so the other healers can work without interruption from potentially intentions, or people's uh, seeing from outside, like other jealous shamans seeing from outside, trying to see what they're up to or to weaken their powers. Um, So that was always happening there. But what I found fascinating to your question was that, okay, the foreigners were aware this was happening, but they just didn't show an interest in it,
Mm,
like almost ever.
mm,
And I think part of the reason is people are there to heal. They're there, they've come, maybe they've been on SSRI antidepressants for 10 years and they're like, gosh, I got to try something new. Maybe they're dealing with like a recent divorce and a property settlement, and they just feel like their lives in disarray, and I'm gonna go drink some ayahuasca. So people are there often with like pretty serious intentions. They're not anthropologists going to learn about sorcery, right? Um, so they just kind of these expectations, these motivations drive their perceptions about what they see, right? And you see that playing out in other ways. So part of my research there, I collected a lot of oral histories about the Civil War period in the late 80s and early 90s, where Shipibo, indigenous, and other indigenous groups, it was a harrowing time where different militia were kind of trying to recruit for their political agenda, the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, and you have all of these shamanic oral histories about how they dealt with these atrocities. And so these discussions would sometimes come up in the sharing, in the knowledge sessions. The healers would start sharing little snippets of these difficult periods 20 years ago when the militia came through and killed people, and the shamans were couldn't do their work, and then the shamans were trying to send visions to the military to get support. And so there's all of this like shamanic knowledge about history that's they're being exposed to. But again, not really that interested in it. People paid a lot of money. They've invested a lot of their personal time to fly halfway around the world, often to kind of heal themselves or to kind of gain something personally. So I would say and I try to make this argument that this kind of I call it a kind of secular enchantment. Maybe secular is not the right word, but that this ignorance towards sorcery provides a kind of immunity from being aware of the inequalities that the Shipibo are dealing with. Issues of ambient poverty in the neighborhood, um, food security, water sanitization, poor health. That there's all of these contextual structural issues that are part of a lot of Shipibo families' worlds that sorcery is actually a discourse that engages these issues to a degree. Police trying to extort the retreat, can be understood was understood as a type of sorcery by the Shipibo healers I worked with, and that this ignorance towards sorcery was also a way for the the attendee, the visitor, to kind of not be cognizant of our own role in
mm,
contributing to these asymmetries by bringing in a lot of money and creating these spaces where, you know, retreat centers are perceived to be bringing in a lot of money
mm,
among Shipibo and other communities, and they're not necessarily are like the economy is not that big. It was only, I think, $20 million in 2019 in Iquitos. Well, actually, that is quite a lot of money. That is quite a lot of money. But the perception is actually what drives a lot of social issues as well. The perception of bringing in a lot of money. So that, yeah, I try to make a kind of social critique of the avoidance of sorcery in the book. Um,
Yeah, well, there's a way, and this ties into how you talk about wonder in the Shipibo context or in the Pachamama temple context as well, which where you talk about at one point saying the experiences of wonder that these participants are having is contingent on them not engaging with the life ways and the realities on the ground, or is it's at least aided by not being that immersed in the life of the Shipibo community. Um, do
hmm.
you see that as, I mean, how do you think about wonder showing up here? I mean, what is wonder given this bracketing of like a lot of context in order for wonder to be possible?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, wonder is such an interesting experience to study. It's been described as an epistemic emotion. So if you compare it to just like shock or surprise, we wonder when our understandings are insufficient. We don't know what's going on. Our knowledge reaches a limit. And I think part of the reason, part of the wonder that psychedelics and ayahuasca evoke for foreigners coming to Peru, yes, you've got the whole like view of indigenous societies and origins of humanity and the noble savage and stuff. But in a more general sense, psychedelics, you know, are imbued with these incredible paradoxes in kind of modern Western society. On the one hand, they've been historically pathologized, they've been criminalized, they still are criminalized, they still are pathologized, and they've been demonized, right? But on the other hand, they've been sacralized into churches, they've been medicalized, and they've been decriminalized, right? So this is paradox. And I think that those paradoxes is part of the reason why these drugs can be so wondrous in themselves. Like, gosh, how could this be illegal when I feel healed and I feel like I'm actually like revisiting some source of life in my spirit and body again.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's all those paradoxes are not necessarily at play for Shipibo healers. The types of wonder that Shipibo describe to me drinking ayahuasca is quite different. First, I should say that, you know, if I was to describe the atmosphere of Shipibo ceremonies that they provide for Westerners, there's a lot of joy, a lot of celebration, there can be a lot of humor. There can be like a playfulness and a silliness uh, too. So there's a kind of like unbridled wonder just within that range of atmospheric potentialities there. But there's also the wonder of um, ayahuasca tourism providing a vehicle into modernization to send. So, when I ask the healers why do you do this work? They say, well, I do it because I want to help people. I like seeing people getting better, but also I want to pay for my daughter's nursing degree. I want to buy a plot of land for my son. I want to buy some technology or go to Europe and learn about what they're doing in Italy, drinking ayahuasca with crystals. And so there is this sense in which ayahuasca provides a kind of wondrous opening towards an entry into modernity. And you see this paradox playing out in primitivist tourism elsewhere, where foreigners come in some sense to renounce the modern world for a more simple way of life, to spend time, get off social media, have a break from your job, have a break from ordinary modern life, and let's go to something more primordial and simple. Let's reduce our diet down and eat some basic food and and that this is somehow a more primordial humanity that we're experiencing. Um, however, yeah.
Just on that, do you see that playing out, at least in the context that you're looking at, and maybe particularly in Australia, this sort of naturalism and return? Is that also wrapped up in a healing modality, that it's healthier to be closer to nature, quote unquote? Or what do you see as sort of the motivating factors for people who are adopting that worldview?
I think it's a range of motivations, definitely a sense of purification, you know, purifying the body and mind. Um, um,
Is it a
absolutely.
spiritual
And then there's
pursuit, like an aesthetic pursuit that you're seeing?
absolutely, there's people who are, whose healing journeys are very much dotted with poetic expressions of aesthetic visions of the spirit of Mother Nature. And yeah, so it's kind of like, I think analytically, it's interesting to separate these out. Like you could say, okay, there's musicians and artists coming and they're getting some spiritual inspiration for their work. But, people who are coming to heal are also very much undergoing an aesthetic experience. And aesthetic also not just in terms of beauty, but in terms of the grotesque, of vomiting and having a kind of synesthesia of thermo shivering in the body. And that and that those grotesque states can be equally wondrous, can be profound and strange in ways that are as aesthetic. And I think, if I was to compare, say, these retreats in the Amazon and the neo shamanism that people are coming to train in or to heal from or to learn from, to the clinics, the psychedelic clinics that are now dotting around the Western world. The Amazonian traditions are very much focused on the body. They're focused on your diet. They're focused on, are you touching other people when you're taking psychedelics? Or what are you looking at? And so there's a whole kind of bodily discipline which is at the core of so much shamanic um, practices in the Amazon. There's a huge anthropological literature on how to be a shaman is to transform your body through what you eat, um, and what you think, and social isolation and things like this. So I think the bodily aspect of dieting that you see on retreat in the Amazon is not simply a kind of health detox, but it's also coming from a more profound metaphysics. So, for example, just last year, I went to do some new research in Peru, and where I went with some doctors and psychologists from Australia who were coming to learn from some Shipibo masters. And um, and the whole notion of stripping back your diet so you don't eat much, you strip back salt and sugars, spices, all the fun things, not all of them, but mostly, that it makes you a bit weak, makes you a bit tired, but also that it helps you hone your visions, that you can have a greater control and mastery over your visionary experience when you drink ayahuasca. And that was certainly has been my experience that, yeah, I might feel a bit weak because my calorie intake is low. My sugar and salts are low. The salt's really tough, getting rid of salt for a few weeks. But then when you're in ceremony and you drink the ayahuasca, the visions are not as kind of erratic. Wow, you can really go and do work. So that's another difference you see in Peru, where the masters are saying, don't if rather than having a mystical experience and being overtaken by the visions, they would suggest maybe have a little bit less so you can actually have a stronger sense of agency and go out and have visions of the type of person you want to be or heal your relationships with people, um, to bring in a kind of beauty and a strength to your visionary space. Um, and it's a bodily practice.
Yeah, yeah, about a bodily practice really about a subjective experience that's then connected. It sounds like to a metaphysics, and I'm interested in thinking across your sites. Were there different understandings of what is happening in a vision and what the importance of a vision is? You've said a little bit about the Shipibo context, but what about in China and Australia? How were visions understood there as doing work, if at all?
Well, there's so much diversity, but I can only draw out a few threads. So I don't want to try and create some essentialism here that Australia is necessarily all like this or the Chinese context all like that. Um, for one example, this one woman in Australia who I studied had drunk ayahuasca like 100 times or more. Gosh, just the variety of visions that she had experienced is so wondrous in itself before you even go into the content of each one. But things like such as like an alternative family that she would not frequently, but she'd sometimes have these visions of this other parallel family that she has, solving world peace and this sense of like global experience. What else did she have? All sorts of bodily experiences of healing and stuff in the body. But just one person can have such a variety of experiences. And then when I kept pressing her, oh, wow, tell me more. What other experiences you had? Eventually, she just kind of got sick of it and laughed at me and said, Alex, I don't really care about the visions that much anymore. I'm not like decoding the meaning and like what's the insight there and who am I meant to be? She says, I just know that it's doing what it needs to do. So there's this sense that, and this is a kind of, as I said, a long-term ayahuasca drinker, that the visions can be a bit of a distraction,
Mhm.
that that there's something else going on. Now, in the Chinese context, something that was, I think, that's quite original or novel in the book is to see how people's visionary experiences were sometimes being put to work for decisions in their businesses. And I wondered whether that this motivation was actually helping to shape the type of visions they were having, which it looks like that they're expectant, their expectations and stuff. So for one example is a guy who would have visions of the interior design of a restaurant. He was a manager for a chain of restaurants in China, in one of the cities in China. And he would basically have these clear visions of the restaurant. And he'd be like, oh gosh, I need to change that design there to try and get repeat customers and to get people to stick around more. And he would say things like, I come out of my visions and I have a very clear idea of what I need to execute in my business and I go and do it. So we see this instrumentalization. Now, this would sound very weird, even sacrilegious, probably, to ayahuasca drinkers in Australia who tend to commune with Mother Nature. But what I argue in the book is that this instrumentalization actually starts to look a lot like, or something like, indigenous Amazonian uses, which were far more pragmatic, drinking ayahuasca to hone your hunting skills, to sharpen your perception, to get a sense of where to go in the rainforest tomorrow to go hunting, or to learn about visitors who are going to come, both your friends and potential foes or enemies, to understand the plans of the whites, the colonists. There's this sense in which the visionary experiences are actually very put to practical use. And I think you could challenge that and you could say, Alex, yeah, but in the therapeutic approach, it's being put to use for psychological therapy. And I think that's a fair description,
Well, or
but
even in the Australian context, it sounds like they're being put to use to counteract a vision of modernity that is inadequate to the many of the participants, many of your interlocutors there.
absolutely, I think so. And I wonder now that psychedelics are becoming legitimized in society, that if that countercultural attitude is still as strong as it used to be, now that it's like, people can talk about ayahuasca at the dinner table. A lot of people I interviewed or encountered in Australia in 2011 to 15, they wouldn't tell their family members or their work colleagues about their ayahuasca use, even though it was kind of at the core of their meaning, their existential meaning system, that they were afraid of ridicule, stigmatization, persecution, even, you know. So things are changing now, and I wonder if it's becoming less of a kind of critical, countercultural space and more of a more kind of like more accepted in society, and then therefore taking on mainstream attitudes and values.
Yeah. Yeah. The, There's a question in the chat about metaphysics that I want to bring in here since we were talking about that a second ago, which is around the question is around observations of some North American ayahuasca tourists seeking alternative medical ontologies through ayahuasca. And really, I think maybe at the core of the question is ontological shift or the desire to change how one sees the world, which I know there's some evidence that psychedelics can change one's metaphysics, but was that something that you were seeing in your field work or encountered yourself during this book project?
Um, I think the question of belief change is really important. It wasn't something I tracked. Um, I think something I one trend that I want to kind of burrow into in my data is that I feel like the more someone really wanted something out of ayahuasca, the more likely they were going to get it. That if they had a really strong expectation that they were going to overcome this depression, that they were going to get their shit together, that they were going to that if they came in with a strong attitude that ayahuasca, the retreat, and not just the brew, but we go through. I should have mentioned that these retreats are have all sorts of activities from flower baths to meditation to you brew your own ayahuasca to you paint your visions, and go on jungle tours and stuff like that. That all of this can maybe enhance that and boost those expectations. I wonder. Um, but one thing I've always wondered about belief change is like um, you hear these stories about people who are atheists taking a psychedelic and becoming religious. But have you ever heard of someone who was religious, spiritual, taking a psychedelic and becoming secular or atheist? And so I've been asking that just in like at conferences and stuff like that. And not, I don't hear many people saying that. But I think, there could be grounds for that type of belief change because of the amount of biological knowledge we have about how psychedelics work on the brain, the pharmacokinetics, that that could be a kind of metaphysics that could take someone out of a more spiritual view into a materialistic universe. But I don't know, in my view, it tends to be the other way around, is what I'm hearing, but I'd like to see some good research on it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you have a sense of maybe why that is? It sounds like in from this work that these experiences with ayahuasca are embedded in particular cultural or community frames, which maybe are not directly religious or spiritual, but are at least drawing on some sense of something larger than oneself. And uh, I wonder whether, I mean, even in the Chinese context, I think, right? Like you're trying to move in the world and like make something bigger. Maybe that's a misread of your book. Um, but I'm curious, like if you had to think about like why are psychedelics moving people in a certain way, and maybe why ayahuasca doesn't seem, at least in your experiences, to be directing people into like an atheist frame. Like, what would you point to as the reason for that?
Well, again, I guess I would see it as the context. Like people are coming to drink ayahuasca with indigenous people with a particular view of what an indigenous person believes. And
Mm,
that tends to be a kind of pantheistic, monistic, spiritual notion that everyone's connected to nature, and and that's part of the wonder for the visitor. But I think, it's interesting because it's like if you look at some of the quote unquote traditional indigenous, mestizo indigenous uses of psychedelic plants, ayahuasca, um, quite often originally it was the healer who takes the substance, not the client, not the patient. And why? Because this is dangerous work. I'm going to go in, I'm the healer. I'm going to go into the other dimension and figure out what's going on, where this pathology came from within the network of humans and non-humans, and come back and try and transmit that. And so, in fact, people would come to ayahuasca not with a kind of deep wonder, but
yeah.
often, like I've heard anthropologists and others describe it as like more like, I don't know, going to the doctor or or a plumber coming over to fix something. That there's a very mundane element to these type of services where ayahuasca is like doesn't have this mystique among mestizo people that you see in foreigners, that it's more kind of mundane,
Mm,
it's more like how we might see a kind of someone working in social welfare or psychology or even or even a plumber. I've heard that metaphor given. So, yes, it's a different metaphysics, but the attitude and the emotion and the experience and the wonder and all of that expectancy that gets brought to the what I call primitivist tourism shapes a certain kind of experience.
yeah. Yeah. Maybe even a more fundamental question here then is, as you were approaching this field work, how were you thinking about and engaging with religious studies, if at all? And what were ways that religion was showing up in this work?
Religion studies. Well, I guess I engaged more the anthropology of religion. Let me think about this carefully. Um, So one I guess direct engagement with religious studies in the book is I do this experimental move to try and understand this notion of integration, that when you take a psychedelic, you go on retreat and you have a profound experience, that the real work begins, people will say, once you go home and you have to integrate the experience, which often means something like making changes in your life or making meaning about the experience or even coping with the
Mm,
heightened stress that a psychedelic experience can certainly bring. Um, so I was trying to understand, well, what is this? What is integration? And one of the problems, one productive problems is that, you don't see this kind of discourse among Shipibo healers. They don't necessarily have an experience and then go and think about and integrate it. And so that I was like, okay, so this is a cultural phenomena. And so I kind of I link it to this notion of the sacred and the profane, which ties back to kind of medieval Europe, where you have the church, which is where the sacred is, and then you go and you have access to the sacred, and then you go back to your mundane lives, which are non-sacred spaces, and where you do work and stuff, and you got to kind of bring it back. The other engagement I did with religious studies was to look at the studies on conversion, which
mhm.
I think is a bit edgy, right? So it's kind of like if you look at the anthropology of conversion, when someone converts to, say, Islam or Christianity, it doesn't happen overnight, even with a mystical experience. It happens over a period of months or years of slowly consolidating knowledge, attitude, perception, where people integrate a whole range of things into this new identity. So I wondered, well, is integration a kind of parallel operation to conversion where people are not converting to a religion as much as quote unquote transforming is what you hear is the verb people use. I'm transforming. So what are you transforming? What are we transforming into when we integrate a psychedelic experience? Well, usually it has to do with the context that we're returning to. And in our modern lives, 2026, there's so many practical demands placed on people depending on where you live, what your job is, who you are in your family or your community, that all that's integration, right? And so I think that conversion can help us kind of get a handle a little bit on understanding how people consolidate changes in themselves after psychedelic experiences or ayahuasca retreats. That would be a couple of ways that religious studies directly, I think, influence the parts of the book.
Yeah, I mean, you have a great section about mysticism, particularly in the Chinese context, where there's this wonderful line where you talk about Weber being puzzled about the way that mysticism or mystical practices are being used to advance sort of a rational capitalist impulse. Um, and
Mm.
I mean, that seems to be suggesting something important about how we think about mysticism or how we think about mystical experiences, which maybe you can tease out what you think that means for religious studies or for any psychedelic practice that's studying mystical type experience.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so that's right. I basically was trying to come to terms with just how practical the the knowledge and the insights that Chinese ayahuasca drinkers were drawing from their ecstatic or altered state experiences, that they were putting it to work in their businesses. Um, and and if you go and read the classic work of Max Weber, who's kind of famous for many contributions, but one of them is to look at the Protestant source of capitalism, saying that the ascetic practice of Protestantism created a certain type of attitude and person who's like, who's how do you say, well, they're well tempered and they have a vocation where their job is at the core of their spirituality, and that's the source of capitalism. And it's been debated, but But when he was setting up that argument, he basically used mysticism as a foil to say, well, the ascetic practice is where you see capitalism emerging. Mysticism is not good for capitalism because the mystic is too interested in the other worlds, that they're out seeking to unify with God, and they're too otherworldly. And so, and I think, it's complicated applying that problem to something like ayahuasca use in China because, for one, there isn't a kind of Christian mysticism necessarily happening there. Sometimes, yes, people are totally overwhelmed by a kind of monistic experience of God or something. But at other times, it's actually more kind of neo-shamanic, where because I guess one difference that you can often see in the literature is the difference between mysticism and shamanism, right? Mysticism is an experience of being overwhelmed by the divine. Shamanism is actually where your sense of self is emboldened and strengthened and extended through prosthetic senses where you can see things and hear things and travel through time and that or transform yourself so you can see things other ways. So you're not surrendering and being overwhelmed by the great oceanic boundlessness, but you're going to work and you've got a strong sense of what you're up to. So probably the it's more in the shamanistic camp, you could say. But still it's interesting that, psychedelics can be used in very practical ways, that people can have a sense of being overwhelmed by a great force and come out of it and feel revitalized and ready to go on and pursue their vocation in the world, that it's not antithetical like Weber
Right, right.
suggests.
And maybe is pointing to some problems with how we're conceptualizing mysticism and how we're conceptualizing shamanism, and maybe there's this, whether it's a blended approach or the categories themselves are just not that useful. I want to, in the last few minutes here, do want to make sure I get to a couple of questions from the audience. Both are methodological. So one is a question around methods within altered states. The last section of the book, you talk about your own experiences drinking ayahuasca as part of your field work, which maybe you can talk a little bit more about the decision to do that and how you found it helpful. And specifically, the question here is around whether or not in those altered states you are conducting ethnography. And if it's possible to conduct ethnography from within these altered states, or if it's a different part of your practice or research.
Great question. Yeah. Yeah, I think how is it helpful to describe your own psychedelic experience as an ethnographer? I included example of my own ayahuasca experience at the end of the book. I think less because I think it's helpful and more because I feel like it's ethical. I spend all this time describing other people's experiences. I feel like it's only fair that I put my subjectivity on the line a little bit as well. So there was a kind of ethics, I think, there. Some of my anthropology colleagues, because we're very interested in reflexivity and how our own backgrounds and interiorities shape what we see and what we do. So I think that, they there could be some interesting work done there on, but it's very risky. Autoethnography has this risk of just becoming so obsessed with the anthropologist rather than what they're actually studying. It becomes this kind of navel gazing pursuit. And, so I think, yeah, it can be helpful, but it can very easily become uninteresting. Um, and methodologically, you know, as an ethnographer, basically, I think I like to demystify fieldwork and ethnography. Yeah, there's like many books on how to do it well and stuff. I resonate with Tim Ingold's notion of deep hanging out, that you spend a lot of time with people and you kind of build trust and get a sense of how a group of people, small group of people or whatnot, feel and view and see things. Um, but in terms of studying psychedelic use, so when I'm on retreat, um, basically when everyone drinks the ayahuasca, there's kind of not that much to observe ethnographically. After you've already been to a few ceremonies in a context, yeah, you might see a few new things here and there, but overall, um, it's dark. People are quiet, often laying down, maybe like 20%, 30, sorry, 80% of the time. You have no idea what's going on inside someone else's experience. Maybe they sit up and start singing or vomiting, and you can start to, okay, remember that. Um, I guess I would make efforts to have small doses
Mm.
quite often, if I want to observe what's going on. But sometimes I think it's, important to go through what people are going through, because then if you come out the other end, I've had plenty of moments at 3 in the morning coming out of an awe-inspiring experience, sitting around with a bunch of people who also had awe-inspiring experiences, and you're in this shared social space. And as an anthropologist, that's really where you want to get to. Like you'll never fully become, well, you can, but become native to wherever you're studying. But you certainly want to try and enter these shared spaces as much as you can while still staying objective to some degree in how you think about those experiences and those spaces. So yeah, and it's how can it be helpful? Well, it can be very unhelpful as well. Like if you live in a society where it's stigmatized and criminalized, it can be very unhelpful to start talking about your drug use. So you have to be careful to only take drugs where it's legal or talk about taking them where it's legal. For example, if you're living in an environment that has a draconian kind of drug policy. So that would be something else worth considering.
Yeah. And maybe that actually segues into the second and maybe final question, depending on time here. But the question is around advice you could give to current anthropology students aiming to be contributors in psychedelic science.
Well, it's an incredible time to get into psychedelic humanities research for a couple of reasons. One is there's like more funding around than ever. There's programs being set up at universities all around the world. There's this huge PhD programs in Europe. Um, and two, like, so the knowledge that we as a global English speaking largely culture have about psychedelics is been shaped a lot by scientific knowledge of really a small amount of clinical trials. And when I say a small amount, yes, there are hundreds of them happening right now, but there are thousands of psychedelic sessions happening every week around the world, I would imagine. And the proliferation and diversity in which this is happening is historic. It's really historic. And we don't really have a sense of it because we're living through it. And ethnography has the chance to really go out. I got a text this morning about someone was describing just how many underground psychedelic therapy services there are in New York. And I was just like, wow. And just their sense of it booming and expanding. So the one thing we know about culture as anthropologists is it's always changing, It's and historically we're living through a very transformative period. So I think ethnography is in a great position to really kind of contribute knowledge to this. I'm often reminded by David Graeber, the anthropologist, who said, what is anthropology for? And to paraphrase it, he saw it as a way of showing different possibilities for how humanity can be, right? So often anthropologists, we've studied things at the margins. Now something at the margins is becoming mainstream, but there's also a hell of a lot of stuff happening at the margins. So I'd really encourage young anthropologists and other humanities scholars to do the good work right now while it's really popular.
All the getting is good. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for taking the time to talk and for sharing your work and just being such a wonderful conversation partner. And thank you to everybody who's still on the Zoom with us. Um, as a just quick reminder, I'll put again in the chat the Psychedelic Intersections Conference coming up here at Harvard Divinity School on April 10th and 11th. Alex Gearin will be one of the presenters at that conference, speaking about some of his new work more focused on clinical psychedelic settings. So if you enjoyed the conversation today, I hope you will join us in April for the conference. I also just want to say a quick thanks to the center's director, Professor Charles Stang, Lori Sedgwick, who helped with organizing, and to the rest of the CSWR team for all of their support. And with that, I will bid everyone adieu. Thank you again, Alex, for being here and taking the time to share. Is there anything you wanted to close with?
Just to extend my gratitude. Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to chat, and I look forward to seeing everyone at Psychedelic Intersections in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here and look forward to seeing everyone here. Have a great rest of your night or morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. All right, be well, everyone.